Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis. Today we're going to do one of my solo shows to try to roll out here. And they're not the easiest thing to do because there's a part of me that wants to sit down and script a whole show and, write out my points and line up the quotations and build an argument, make a point. But it's not that fun. And, I'm not really in the habit of doing that. The first time I gave a public lecture in the New York Open Center, and I think it was 1991, I prepared. I was giving a public lecture on Philip K. Dick, and Valis and Gnosis. It was super fun. New York Open Center at that time gave me a lot of room to develop the peculiar thoughts that have become my stock in quote-unquote trade. But at that time, I did a good job, and then I gave my talk. But I realized, I was like, I put in a lot of time to that talk, but, if I'm going to be doing these talks and I, learn to not really prepare very much, I'm just going to save a lot of time. And I wouldn't say that I'm lazy. I can be a very dedicated person. I've done this show almost every week for 8 years, and I've written books and blah, blah, blah. You need a little bit of self-discipline to get going with that kind of workload. But I'm also a bit of a slacker. So I realized that, hey, if I just sort of got better at kind of not really preparing very much and then riffing, well, that would be a nifty thing. Now, it's a little different when you're riffing inside, in a hall with a bunch of people. You can kind of sense where they're at. You can, what jokes they laugh at, what points seem obscure. You say something and you can tell no one's getting it, and then you stop and kind of redo it. So it's a lot more fun. It's or more interactive. It's more like a jazz performance, and it's totally true. I mean, this is weird to admit, but it's totally true that my best talks have all been with the coolest crowds. Not because I'm like, oh, these guys are cool, I'm going to bring out my best stuff, but because I basically just open my mouth. I have a few ideas. I have a rough idea of where I'm going. It's not like completely spontaneous. Like Terrence was completely spontaneous, or almost completely spontaneous. He could just start. That's a little bit too much for me. I like to have a little bit of a game plan, 4 or 5 talking points written down on the back of an envelope or something like that. But it's really been very clear that the times I've done that when there was a hostile audience have been cold and crimped, somewhat stuck. And on the other side, when I've been speaking with people in front of people who are wide open, curious, vivacious, strange, that I've said many things that I just have never said or thought before. And it's an amazing thing. If you're a musician who improvises, the feeling. You're suddenly doing something you've never done before, and you're able to even recognize it as pretty fucking good. And you're like, where did that come from? It's an amazing thing about being human. We walk around with our stories in our heads all the time going, oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, why'd I do that? Oh, that person did that thing to me, I got to do that thing back to them, da-da-da-da. And yet when we stop and open our mouths, we're actually not really controlling what we're saying most of the time. There's just sort of an interaction, and words come out, sense comes out, allusions come out, sometimes to things we're not even exactly entirely aware of. And it's sort of a marvelous, magical thing about our everyday lives, even though it's completely banal and ordinary. We do it every day. I had a professor at Rice, very sophisticated guy, like heavy duty philosophical dude. We started the class, we went right back to Aristotle and the idea of substance, and he made sure that we understood the novelty of the idea of substance at that point in history and how it had conditioned, in some sense, all of philosophy since that point. So he was a heavy-duty guy, but he talked about this question of decision, making decisions. He had a great analogy, which has never left me, which is you wake up and you don't get out of bed immediately. You lie there, whatever. You turn the alarm off. You're going to get up, but you don't get up right away. So you lie there, and you're getting up, but you keep lying there. And you think, well, I should get up, but you keep lying there, and then you get up. Who did that? Did you decide to get up? Well, no, you'd already decided to get up. But when you get up, that's something else. You're not doing that. So who is that you? Anyway, it's kind of fun to tap into that guy when I'm giving talks. But somehow doing it with a podcast is a little bit stranger. It feels a little more risky, a little more vulnerable. For one thing, I'm not getting any feedback from the crowd, so I can't kind of play off people's facial expressions or their energy bodies or whatever it is that inspires me to move in a certain direction. And the other thing is that particularly because they're being distributed online, it feels a little more exposed, a little more vulnerable. Like it might be safer just to actually kind of script the thing out, make sure I got all my points under control and I got my angles, I got my, maybe even write it out. People write out their self-produced podcasts almost exclusively, unless they're having a conversation. So of course it's easy having a conversation and not write things out. That's really boring. Even for the interviewer, even though a lot of interviewers write them out, still kind of boring. I think the intros are kind of boring. When I'm sitting there listening to the radio and I'm hearing someone and I realize they're reading, I'm bored. Like I'm like, why are you reading? Just say it. Now some people can write something and then spit it back like an actor and it doesn't sound like a text. Go for it. That's great. I don't have any problem with that. But that way that you get a lot of reviews on NPR where they squeeze out the meaning of the word they're attaching to some record album or some new television show. And you totally know they're reading and it's just boring. It's an open medium. We should be increasing the space for liveliness and mistakes. But verbal mistakes can get you in trouble these days. I mean, they could always get you in trouble, but they can really get you in trouble these days. And sometimes I'm afraid I'm going to spill out and say something that's going to come back and haunt me. But that's the risk. That's the risk I'm taking. So what I'm going to talk about today is the Psychedelic Sangha. Psychedelic Sangha is a organization, I guess you call it, a mini movement. I don't know what you call it when there's just a few people talking about stuff and they decide to start doing things in different cities, but a mini movement that was started or conceived initially by some characters in the East Coast, including Catherine McLean, who we've had on the podcast many years ago. She was one of the researchers at Johns Hopkins working on psilocybin, and so heavy duty researcher. She was one of the people who really guided a lot of the sessions, but ended up getting frustrated with the academy and research science and the program, and kind of went her own way. She's a serious Buddhist practitioner and a good rabble-rouser in the psychedelic circuit. She's a wonderful woman, as well as my pal Chris Kelly, another wild psychonaut from New York City, and they came up with this notion, the Psychedelic Sangha, the idea of bringing together people who are interested in psychedelics, people who were drawn to psychedelics, and people who had some committed relationship with the Dharma, by which we mean mostly Buddhism, but not exclusively, because some of the other characters in the fold run a little bit more on the Hindu tip. But really what unites it is a certain commitment to dharmic practice, the notion that it's not just about reading books, but it's about doing stuff and doing stuff regularly with a certain intention, with a certain directionality. Now, what I was excited by with this conjunction, the Psychedelic Sangha, was I've been really kind of struggling with what to do about particularly the explosion of interest in psychedelics. I've probably explained this some before, but it's worth mentioning that when you're someone like me, who's half a century old and who came up in the psychedelic underground from a teenage time and moved through the evolution of this underground, even as the underground became more conscious of itself, more committed to public discourse, to conferences, to publications, to magazines, to zines, to the online communications. I mean, it's always been sort of a chatty, nerdy world, the modern psychedelia, but it definitely, went the way of many subcultures in the late 80s, 1990s, were becoming more committed to kind of communication, people getting together, etc., into the 2000s. So I have all this knowledge and experience and ideas and people I've known and people I've had communications with, and train wrecks I've seen, and absurdities, visions, all this whole wild, uncontrolled panoply of experiences and ideas. And now we're in such a different world. I mean, in this as in all worlds, everything's changed. Everything has changed. And it's mostly kind of hard. And while some people have come to embrace psychedelics as something positive in the change, that there are, all these wonderful ways that they can help people, and wonderful ways they can help people with issues with trauma, psychological problems, and even just to restore some sense of the sacred. That the scientists tell us that psychedelics can occasion mystical experience. Now you may go, what is mystical experience exactly? But science knows. Now the researchers have told us that yes, it is mystical. It may just seem mystical, and sometimes it may seem absurd or terrifying, but we're not going to talk about the absurd or terrifying parts of the experience. We want to talk about the mystical parts of the experience. So if you're someone like me, this contemporary construction of psychedelics as safe, as good for your well-being, as healthy, as beneficial, as mystical or sacred, it's understandable. I actually believe all of that, or that it can be that, or those things can be that. But at the same time, it's changed the frame so drastically, and it seems so unsubtle and frankly kind of ignorant a lot of the time, at least ignorant in relationship to the kinds of experiences that I've had and the communities that I've been a part of, in terms of really embracing the ambiguity and weirdness and tricksiness and sometimes disturbing character of these substances and these experiences. So I'm like, what do I do with this stuff? Am I supposed to go out there and go like, hey guys, it's more complicated than that, and like be kind of a grumpy old man? That's so boring. I mean, I'm probably destined to become a grumpy old man. Maybe I'm already a grumpy old man in some ways, but I think it's really important to resist that as much as possible. So to be a little more proactive, a little more productive in terms of my focus. And I realized that this particular connection, the connection between spiritual psychedelic use, or psychedelics taken in the spirit of spirituality or religion, mixed with the sort of fringe or underground within American Buddhism, or within the Western Dharma, that has been inspired by, drawn to, and even returns to regularly psychedelics as part of a committed life, perhaps a little heretical, perhaps a little bit on the sly, but nonetheless committed to a life of Dharma, whatever that exactly means. Now, of course, Buddhism and the Dharma has been transforming a great deal lately, particularly if you look at mindfulness as a part of Buddhism, though in many ways what's happened now is that practices associated with Buddhism and the Dharma have been so secularized that they're able to be relatively easily detached to some degree, and now they've kind of have a life on their own. But as that process has happened, of course, Buddhism itself has changed. And it's quite clear that, like yoga, Buddhism, and to a certain degree psychedelics already are bound up with this increasingly intense sort of engine of consumer capitalism that's focused on well-being, on wholeness, on being the best you can be, and being happy, and this whole kind of like this sort of like construction of subjective happiness and positivity as something that's managed by experts, by products, by mainstream discourse, and all embedded very comfortably in a kind of like, hey, neoliberalism's not that bad. Let's just kind of keep it going, and get some smiles out there, people, and everything will be working out. So it's a complex time, but I for me, that connection is a really sweet one. And I first wrote about it. I've been thinking about it for a long time. I've always been interested in kind of conventional expressions of spirituality and religion, and I was interested in psychedelics. So obviously, I was interested in their overlap. Not just interested, but participating in it, absorbing it, playing with it. But when I heard about Zigzag Zen, the first edition of Zigzag Zen, that this guy, Alan Bediner, was putting together a collection of articles from some heavy Buddhists and other characters about the connection between psychedelics and Buddhism, I was like, oh man, I got to get in that thing. So I sought him out. I found him at a party, and I just, stuck my foot in the door and was kind of obnoxious about it, but he agreed to, and I wrote one of my favorite pieces in some ways. I think it's really, it stands up. It's called the Paisley Gate. And the story that starts it off is worth relating. I was at the San Francisco Zen Center. I sat there for many years, especially at the Green Gulch campus, I was almost going to say, but Green Gulch Retreat Center in Marin County, which is just a beautiful place. I mean, whatever else you want to say, it's just a beautiful, beautiful place. And one day we were sitting around in an unusually casual situation with the teacher, Reb Anderson, and there were a couple of other people sitting around, and was just kind of chatting. And this woman, in a very Marin County way, said, basically, she asked, is Jerry Garcia a bodhisattva? Which is, a terribly Marin County question to ask. And it was asked with sincerity. And so Reb responded with sincerity. And I really admire his response. Because what are you going to say, And he said, well, in Buddhist cosmology, there are these beings called protectors. And in the Tibetan Vajrayana, you talk about lokapalas, or these spirits of place. Basically, they're the pagan gods, or the pre-Buddhist gods, who, deep, earthy, quote-unquote shamanic, super indigenous, pretty intense. You're not going to just like whistle by them if you meet them at the crossroads at midnight, those kind of characters. So when Buddhism came into Tibet, and especially, well, what are you going to do with these guys? So there's these kind of wizard wars and political tensions. And after all this kind of happens and Buddhism wins the field, that these beings are incorporated as protectors. So yes, they are part of the Buddhist, framework. They're part of the matrix of entities that both exist and don't exist at the same time, and create the kind of imaginal and psychic environments, the theater of the Dharma in that particular area. But they still retain some of their outsiderness, their roughness, their barbaric tendencies, let's say, which is probably not quite the right word to use, but let's just go with it for now. In any case, it's certainly the right word to use for Jerry Garcia in the context of whether or not he's a bodhisattva. So no, he was not a bodhisattva, but there was a certain kind of energy around the Grateful Dead that created a space within which a certain kind of very feral, psychedelic Western Dharma existed. I mean, the point to refer to here is the song Eyes of the World, which is also the title of a Dzogchen chapbook out there. So, you go with that one. And if you listen to those lyrics in the right frame of mind, well, it's a pretty crystalline teaching you may be downloading at that point. But Reb was straight to make the point that this was not exactly the Dharma. And good point. Later on, I did a podcast with Vince Horn over at Buddhist Geeks. Great podcast. And he titled it somewhat unwisely, "Is Jerry Garcia a Bodhisattva?" Because I told this story. And he got a lot of grief. Not a little grief. A lot of grief. I was like, oh, Jerry Garcia's a heroin addict. And you're like, well, yeah, okay. But, we could talk about the Mahasiddhas. We could talk about the characters in Tibet who are, were seen as great, wise teachers that led seriously unconventional lives. But hey, we'll just let that alone. And we'll just acknowledge that there's a lot of pushback against this kind of thing. But for me, what I recognized, and this is where I thought I was actually being smart for once, was that this pointed towards something really interesting about the Dharma, which is that it's kind of tantric, the psychedelic Dharma, because like Tantra, it involves secrecy. Can't really talk about it. You're going to get busted by the cops. In fact, even if you're working at a Dharma center or you're participating in a Dharma center, you probably don't want to tell people that you're a regular tripper. They're not going to like that. Rick Strassman, for example, the guy who wrote did all the DMT studies and wrote the Spirit Molecule, he was a heavy-duty Zen practitioner, and his Sangha did not like what he was doing. And it became so conflictual that he bailed. And then he found his way towards Orthodox Judaism, whatever. We lost one, as I could say as a Buddhist. Though I think it's just as good to be Orthodox. In fact, it's in some ways more interesting to be an Orthodox Jewish psychonaut. That's another topic. But the point being that in a weird way, psychedelics within the established Western Dharma function like a Tantra because they're sort of secret and because they're kind of magical. That a lot of tantric practices involve, what we could loosely call magic. You're using visualization, you're doing ritual, you're doing mantra, there's incense, you're calling up deities, the deities are doing things, some of them have knives, some of them are having sex. It's a juicy, energetic world, and you're internalizing these powers inside your body, which is revealed to be this semi-virtual network of astral forces and flows and knots of energy, and that these energies can be manipulated or alchemically transformed through various practices that involve ritual and these deities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, I'm not trying to make too simplistic an analogy here, but within an already more informal, mixed up Western Dharma, it seemed to me pretty clear that psychedelics were kind of playing that role. Well, now things are kind of changing, and it's sort of interesting to intervene into this conversation again, now that both psychedelics and Buddhism are receiving more attention. That meditation is part of corporate seminars. It's widely practiced. Mindfulness is everywhere. It's in the museum. It's in the university. And again, it's not quite the same thing as Buddhism with a capital B, but there's clearly a connection. And at the same time, of course, psychedelics have really transformed in a way that they're not really secret in that way. I mean, even if you still can get thrown in jail for manufacturing or distributing them or consuming them, and that should never be forgotten, because there are people who are suffering in jail right now in needless ways, some of them with terribly long prison sentences that are as unfair as when they're back in the day when they were giving out bigger sentences for crack dealers than for people who were snorting powder cocaine because of the weight issue. I mean, it's totally absurd. But acid dealers get busted for the same thing. They get the material substance gets weighed as part of the amount of the drug, and so some of these guys are in for a very, very long period of time, which should not be forgotten. Nonetheless, in terms of the public world, in terms of the sort of public discourse, the theater of the acceptable, the allowable, the Overton window, whatever you want to call it, psychedelics have really changed the game. So it becomes a very interesting question. How do we talk about this again? So I had done one Psychedelic Sangha event with my good friend Spiros Antonopoulos in Los Angeles. And Spiros, he's been on the show, so if you're a hardcore listener, you probably remember he came on and talked about his seizure, essentially. Basically, he had a mini stroke, and a fascinating thing for a spiritual and serious yogic practitioner to talk about. But he's a deep yogi. He's got a yoga studio called the Los Angeles Yoga Club in downtown LA, and connected with Ardor Labs, which is a super cool sort of apothecary. Really groovy guy. And we did one of this Psychedelic Sangha event. We put it out there, put it on a meetup, and it kind of got around, this and that, da-da-da. And then, there was about 30 people there. It was a nice show up for not too much advertising. And, downtown LA is kind of a hassle for people to get to, especially from the west side. But people showed up. And there were some practitioners there. There were some people there. There was one guy in particular who talked about doing a lot of concentration practice in particular. And he made the point, which I fully agree with, that if you're really, dive into concentration practice, shamatha practice very seriously, and you keep at it for a while, either over years or, over days intensively, it gets basically psychedelic. Not even like psychedelic or pretty psychedelic. It gets psychedelic. But most of the people there were psychedelic people. I mean, not that you can't be both, that's part of the point, but there's definitely a sort of tension between psychedelic people who have spiritual aspirations, and that might include Buddhism, but maybe they don't sit that much, and they probably haven't read too many sutras, but they like the picture of the Buddha, and they like the idea of meditation, and they've done a little bit of it, and they like the whatever. They're totally awesome. Great. Love it. On the other side, though, is a little more interesting to me category, which is people who have a committed Dharma practice, who have either maybe they used to do psychedelics and they're interested again, or they already do them both, but kind of, haven't talked about it too much. And those folks to me, for whatever reason, a little more interesting, maybe just because I've spent a lot of time at psychedelic conferences and around a lot of, psychedelic characters. So I love it. It's my home in some ways, but it's not as novel for me. And I realized it may have been partly because of the place we did it. So when I was trying to find a place up here in San Francisco to do the Psychedelic Sangha, I was like, I want to do it at a Dharma center. But I didn't think that was very likely, because almost all Dharma centers are just going to say, no way, buddy, no way. Because even if this is, as I will argue, already part of the Western Dharma, and has been so for a very long time, certainly longer than almost all the traditions that have been operative in the West have been here. There have been people taking drugs and exploring the Dharma seriously. So it's part of the picture. Nonetheless, it just doesn't look good. It's still too greasy kid stuff. It's still too much of a drug. So it disturbs people. They don't like the profile. They don't like the association. So I didn't think it was very likely. But then I was talking to my new pal, Michael Taft, who does another great podcast. I like the geeky Buddhist podcast, clearly, because Michael's, I mentioned Vincent Horton's and Buddhist Geeks. Michael's is called Deconstructing Yourself. And it's has a super nerdy focus on meditation. Really high-level discussion, really fascinating. I've learned a huge amount. And Michael invited me to be on a show, and I'm actually kind of glad I hadn't really listened to the show before. So I do that as part of the spontaneous thing, or the lazy equals spontaneous thing that I mentioned at the beginning of the show. So I'm like, I should listen to the show, and I didn't get around to it. But I went in there and we talked about Robert Anton Wilson and psychedelics, talked about Buddhism, talked about practice, talked about faith and weirdness versus the contemporary corporate realities. And he teaches meditation in some corporate situations, so it was really interesting to hear him, because he's clearly a freak. He's all tatted up and long hair, and he's got that wizardly twinkle in his eyes. So, a fascinating conversation. And then I enjoyed it so much, I went back and listened to the show, and, been hanging out with him more. And he also teaches at a place in San Francisco called the San Francisco Dharma Collective, which sounds pretty cool, right? You're like, ooh, Dharma Collective. I like the sound of that. And you should, because it's really interesting. And what the story of the San Francisco Dharma Collective is that the building where it takes place once was the local outpost of Against the Stream, which was Noah Levine's outfit. And he was the Dharma punk dude, also tatted up, also intense character, very successful, very charismatic teacher. A lot of folks in recovery did a kind of recovery, so it was very like street gritty, transformed through the Dharma kind of thing. It definitely helped a lot of people. Seemed pretty positive to me. I didn't read the book or anything, but it seemed like a good character that up. But he didn't just get Me Too'd like it's some kind of like, well, he was like, flirting with the girls or something, or even he did some bad stuff. I don't know the details. I don't really want to know the details, but let's just say that everybody agrees that he pretty much, well, not everybody, but a lot of people agree that he, deserved to go down, even if they didn't like exactly the way that happens in some communities. So there's been a lot of this in the Buddhist world. There's been a lot of this in the whole history of guru scenes and Eastern paths and esoteric orders in the West. But of course, it's also been in mainstream religions as well, not to mention business, not to mention the academy. It's a pervasive issue. But in the Buddhist world, it's somehow even more grating, because you think these people would have their shit together a little better and have a little more awareness about what they're doing and the karmic effects of what they do on the other people who are in their groups and who are really hurt by this kind of stuff. And things were pretty wild and weird in the 70s. I kind of give the 70s a little bit more slack, even though there's reasons to be critical of it, for sure, without question. And we're in a different time. In any case, Noah went down, Against the Stream went down, but the folks who were left were like, hey, we don't want to stop. We like this. So they took over the lease. They established a collective. They have, they're developing their own process about how to make decisions and how to book different teachers and what to do with the space, how to, generate funds and all that. But it's basically a headless organization, or as they put it, there is an empty throne there, which is really marvelous because it's about, not the Buddha so much. I mean, it is about the Buddha, but it's really about the Sangha, the collective, the group, the people. And that was what was important about Psychedelic Sangha, is that we're not saying psychedelic Buddha. Like, yeah, let's all be Buddhas, or Buddha's psychedelic. Maybe Buddha's psychedelic, maybe Buddha's not psychedelic. I don't even really know what that means. Some of the pictures are kind of trippy, but I'm not really sure what that means. We're not really talking about the psychedelic Dharma. I think there is a connection there. I think there are aspects of the Dharma, aspects of questions of no self, of interdependence, of the both here, not here nature of visionary experience that dovetail quite well with the sophisticated approach to psychedelics. But I wouldn't make that strong a claim. But the psychedelic Sangha is definitely there. It's just real. It's just a historical reality. And it's not just now. It's not just 10 years ago. It's not just 20 years ago. It's not just 30 years ago. I mean, it goes back till at least the late 1940s. And if you want to fudge and go earlier, you can do that to some degree as well. You go back to Alan Bennett, Aleister Crowley's sort of like esoteric big brother, who used a lot of drugs, not psychedelics as far as we can tell, but opium and chloroform even to treat his asthma. And he kind of and he was interested in them as a magician, as somebody who was interested in the esoteric practices. He was in the Golden Dawn, along with Crowley and Yeats and all those characters. And for him, drugs were part of the way of exploring the mind. And then later on, he became, I think, the second British person to formally become a bhikkhu in the Theravadan tradition in Burma. And he lived in Ceylon a lot. So not quite the same thing as, beatniks eating peyote and then, meditating in Zen and listening to John Cage records or whatever. But, goes along with the point. But the idea really is that it's Sangha focused. It's about what people are actually doing and how people can kind of come together and work through these enormous questions together. So through Michael's encouragement, I approached SF Dharma Collective, and kind of surprising both of us, they said, sure, let's try it out. Well, it was a little more complicated than that. So while we were able to do the first gathering at the space, and we'll do a few more there at the very least, there was some pushback. And that was actually kind of interesting. Even as the pushback mounted and there was kind of stuff online, and I'm not on Facebook, so I didn't have to read it directly, but there was sort of a Facebook debate or whatever. I was actually really engaged and really interested. I kind of peaked up. In fact, the fact that for some Buddhists this conversation is anathema, is heretical, is, and this is to quote a blog post I read, evil. Evil. I loved it. I was like, I almost made me happy. I was like, oh my God, at this point in the game, when like every proclivity has been sort of embraced by, multicultural capitalism as being okay, whatever, you do that, we do this, no big deal, just kind of, be mellow about it. Like, it's really hard to be heretical. You might like whatever, call for, killing everybody or something like that. But, you got to work a little hard to be a heretic. But in this case, it still really disturbs people. And I say that in a very respectful way. That really interests me. It makes me feel like there's more at stake. It makes me feel like everybody in the game has to rise to the occasion of being clear about what the issues are. Like, for the most part, I really avoid political arguments, even discussions to deep extents on Twitter, because it's a terrible place to have conversation. I can't believe people wage, like, their primary place where they wage politics or mint political discourse is in Twitter. It's like, it's horrible. It's one of the toxic things about our reality. But I did dive into some heated words with a certain Brad Warner, who's a Zen guy from Los Angeles. He's a very sprightly writer. I like his writing. I like a lot of the energy that he brings to the Dharma. He has some of that street punkish energy as well. But man, does he not like this stuff. He is so rude. Oh, it was impressive. Anyway, I'll leave that aside. I'm sure I'll be chatting with him at some point in the future if I keep doing this in any case. But in any case, there was real pushback from the Dharma Collective, and that was worth kind of playing with. What are these issues? What are the ways people say this is not part of the Dharma? This should not be part of the discussion of contemporary practitioners of Buddhism and related currents. One is, in Buddhism, the notorious fifth precept, which says, don't take intoxicants. No intoxicants. Now, there's a lot of things to say about this. You can go, well, what does the word actually mean in its original context? And the thing about precepts is that it's just like the Constitution. In the Supreme Court, you got the originalists, the right, who are like, you can't make the Constitution deal with some contemporary political problem just because that's what you think is important. The Constitution has to be respected for what the people who wrote it originally intended. That's as much as we can say. All this new stuff, all these new rights, whatever, right to marry whoever you want to or something. That's not, you can't make the Constitution say that. That's like it's a bad ventriloquism. So that's an originalist. And then most of us who are more aware of how his history works go, yes, but you're always going to be, revising, reinterpreting, reframing, even if you're a conservative, vis-a-vis this document. Words are open, meanings are open. We're spilling forward into history. There's no ground. It's kind of scary, but tough. That's where we are. So let's try to be nice to people. So in any case, you have the same kind of tension there. So if you go back and it goes like, it's pretty clear from the Pali, at least the people who know their lingo, that intoxicants means, as you might expect, alcohol. Now, I'm not even going to talk about how many people who are, serious Dharma practitioners who at some point still have alcohol. I do, but I never took the precepts. So I don't really count. I'm kind of a heretic by nature, or a non-joiner. Nonetheless, leaving aside the issue around alcohol and other forms of acceptable intoxicants like tobacco or caffeine or or hell, Wellbutrin and other sorts of psychoactives, that there are some psychoactives that we can consider intoxicants, and obviously these quote unquote drugs, psychedelics, can be put in that category. But of course, that it's the history there. It just gets so murky so fast. It's really hard to do that, because if you're saying no, psychedelics are intoxicants the way that alcohol is an intoxicant, and that's what they would have meant back. That's what the Buddha would have meant. Well, that's not really true, because if any time out of modernity, any place in the world that people have been using these kinds of substances, just the classic psychedelics that are working on serotonin receptors with tryptamines, any place you see that, it's enveloped in some kind of, if not sacred, then at least healing, very culturally rich, very much not just about getting off kind of framework. So psychedelics aren't intrinsically intoxicants. Maybe in the modern world, they become intoxicants and can be abused as intoxicants, which is clearly the case. Clearly, people who are, heavy drug users will sometimes take mushrooms or LSD the way that they would do more cocaine, or, do some heroin and do some crystal meth. It's just this whole big smorgasbord of intoxicants. But if they're not essentially intoxicants, then we have to be like, well, what's an intoxicant then? I mean, if we can take things that aren't essentially intoxicants and turn them into intoxicants through our practice, just because they're psychoactives working on our neurology, it doesn't really work so well, because, rage is an intoxicant. You feel it in your body. It feels good. Lust is a terrible intoxicant. Oh my God, it feels great. It's moving through your system, and your mind changes. You can't think straight. You make bad decisions. You're full of yourself. Your ego is like bursting out. You're like a lion. Lion of lust. There's intoxicants everywhere you go. So it's not really clear to me that the spirit of the precept, let alone the letter, or actually the letter of the precept, let alone the spirit, would really lead one to absolutely denigrate these substances, which have such a rich history within, non-modern cultures, and which are clearly used by many modern people in a spiritual context. So I have a lot of respect for people in recovery, and there were a lot of people in recovery who were part of the SF Dharma collective, and there were some who came to the Psychedelic Sangha, and we had some really great conversations about it. They kind of improved some of my angles. It was a really rich conversation. But it also has to be said that some people use psychedelics to get over addictions. And as early as the 1950s, there was a robust amount of psychological research that showed that it helped alcoholics. Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, had a psychedelic experience on LSD, and it partly gave him the awareness of how an experience of a higher source, a higher power, could change your attitude towards your own proclivities, and out of that come up with a particular kind of quasi-religious cosmology of AA. So clearly these things, let alone talking about ibogaine and heroin addiction, and there are some people who need to go through recovery, and then they don't stay completely off of psychoactives, and they let some back in, maybe a little cannabis, maybe they occasionally do psychedelics while still being very much on the path, so to speak. So these were really interesting conversations to be having in the context of the psychedelic. But again, the main issue that I wanted to emphasize was simply that it's already part of the picture. And to talk about that, I read a great Alan Watts essay from a great Alan Watts collection, which I really recommend to people. It's short, it's sweet, it's got everything you like in Watts, called This Is It, and other essays. And it's got essays on, anxiety and Zen. It's not so much deep Zen culture, but more in its contemporary expression. And there's an essay called Beat Zen, Square Zen, and Zen, where he talks a little bit about psychoactives. And there's also his first essay about LSD called The New Alchemy, which is really terrific. It's a couple years before the Joyous Cosmology, which is also worth reading. And what's good about it is he takes a very level-headed approach. He says, like, look, there's these two schools, the Beat Zen and the Square Zen. And Beat Zen is the beatniks. It's like, do whatever you want, man. The new spirit of refusal, the kind of emergence of the anti-authoritarian, anti-system attitude that would then flower in the 60s. With the hippies and the radicals, but was already nascent in the kind of beat mode of the 1950s, for whom Zen in particular was very, very important. And Watts was critical of this attitude. He was critical. He said Zen doesn't mean you can just do whatever you want. It doesn't mean you can just like be lazy and drop out. That's a misreading. And at the same time, if you look on the other side, what he called Square Zen, in Square Zen you had, people who were very rigorously trying to reproduce the transmission and the tradition and clinging to all of the accoutrement, the robes, the language, the gestures, the arrogance, the superiority, the outperforming, the whole kind of competitive institutional framework that is a part of any religion, definitely part of Japanese Zen, and definitely part of American Zen as something that picked it up and to some extent needs it. You kind of need your martinets. You need those structuralists, to misuse that term, in order to keep the framework going. But Watts had a really, really interesting thing to say about this, which is that they're both kind of wrong. And the reason they're both wrong is that they are both using Zen as a way to play out something that is profoundly, ultimately kind of political, but very much an unconscious aspect of their own culture. So this is what he said. He goes, for the Westerner who is attracted by Zen and who would understand it deeply must have one indispensable qualification. He must understand his own culture so thoroughly that he's no longer swayed by its premises unconsciously. And what he was saying was that the unconscious premises have to do with authority and with institutions and with the system. So the beatniks were rejecting it, and they used Zen to reject it. And the Square Zenists were embracing it, or embracing their kind of Christian authoritarian history and translating it into another tongue. And I thought that was a very good insight, not because it tells us about our own moment in terms of this question of authority, but it's more the question of what our unconscious cultural premises are. And this is where things get really rich. Because both Buddhism, especially mindfulness, and psychedelics in its new flourishing phase are bound up in very interesting, intense ways with the premises of late capitalism in very specific, very noticeable, and also very confusing ways. And this is, in some sense, a whole other conversation. I wanted to focus on this connection between psychedelics and the Dharma, but they're both kind of at this moment where I feel like they both need people to start to wake up and to, as he puts it, understand our own culture so thoroughly that we no longer are swayed by its premises unconsciously. We become aware of the way that our desire for well-being, our desire for happiness, our desire for peacefulness, our desire to reduce stress, our desires to heal our wounds are not innocent. They are not, nothing is innocent at this stage in the game, and it doesn't mean you don't pursue those things, but we have to become more conscious and more critical about how we're pursuing them and what the ultimate goal and the intentions of our pursuit are. And I believe that a good combination of these two things can actually set us going in the right way. And I want to spend the last few minutes talking about that, about how Buddhism can help psychedelic seekers and how psychedelics can help Buddhist seekers. And again, this is a big conversation. It's something we're working out through the Psychedelic Sangha, but here's just a couple of thoughts. It's a little easier to see the first one, how people who really go into psychedelics can be helped by the Dharma. One of the things that can happen very easily with excessive psychedelic use is a sort of deluded character, a way of believing the visions, let's say, a kind of a psychological inflation, a kind of magical thinking that in small doses and, sometimes in big doses, but for short periods of time, is really groovy, but as a lifestyle can be very problematic. And what you find within that kind of psychedelic framework, and again, I'm not talking about people who are doing it for very specific psychological reasons in the kind of new zone. I'm talking about psychedelic culture as I've known it, is that there's not a lot of kind of checking going on. There's not a lot of negative feedback mechanisms that might interrupt your new trip, because it's such a goofy, in some ways kind of lazy and uninformed space, that it's really easy just to run with whatever concept you're going. And there are people and ideas and processes and especially collective operations that can help push against that. Those kinds of mechanisms have been improving very noticeably, over the years, over the decades, as people, try to figure out how do we become mature in this practice. And I think a lot of elements of Buddhism, the commitment to a daily practice, the getting to the serious mind training that you do outside of any wild experience, so that when you go in there, you have a better trained mind, and when you come down, you're much better able to integrate the scary stuff, the beautiful stuff, simply because you've been devoted to a certain idea of mind training. But I also think there are elements within the Dharma, within the philosophical dimension of Buddhism, that are extremely helpful. Lessons about no self, that keep you from the void of nihilism and the kind of goofiness of believing you're everything. These ideas, which can be very psychedelic in essence, have been worked out and played out and reframed and reshaped through the course of the very rich and diverse traditions of Buddhism, in a way that you can kind of work through kinds of more intense, in-your-face experiences in a certain frame. And finally, I believe that Buddhism properly practiced, I don't know what that means exactly, kind of we'll leave that aside, but that Buddhism taken, swallowed deeply, is a critical practice. That criticism, critique, questioning, sometimes lacerating questions are part of the practice, not the whole thing. If it was the whole thing, it wouldn't work. But it's a very, very significant part of it. As Chris Kelly, one of the Psychedelic Sangha founders, said, Buddhism is stressful. Now, man, I love that line, because everyone's like, no, it's about relieving stress, man. And your job's bumming you out. You do a little meditation, mindfulness, you feel better. Great. No, that's not. That's baby steps. That's first grade. The deeper you go into it, especially when you try to integrate it, especially when you're dealing with the chaos and confusions of our historical moment, it's stressful, because you got to keep asking critical questions about your experience, about authority, about why you're doing what you're doing, about who's benefiting from that. You can't leave those things at the door. You can leave them at the door sometimes to go into the Dharma retreat where you're not going to think about this stuff anymore. Great. But it's not part of the whole package deal. And on the flip side, I also believe that for some Buddhist practitioners, only for some, I would never say that this is something that should be widely practiced. I don't believe that's true. But for some Buddhist practitioners, I suspect that psychedelics have a lot to hold. For one, they open up realms of emotion, of intense emotion, that are very powerful, sometimes very scary, but potentially very transformative. And people don't talk enough about that. They talk about the visions or the entities or the the kind of peak experiences when you see that you're one with everything or whatever. I think peak experiences are way overrated. I think, and even in those, what's less often is more important than the insight or the vision or the idea or the the clear seeing is the emotions that go along with it, the emotions that lead up to it, the fear, the confusion, the strange intensities that move through your body. And all of these are grist for the mill of mindfulness, grist for the mill of internal alchemy. And so I think that Buddhists can sort of have a place to experience wonder, intensity, and deeply embodied, energetic flowerings that allow for the kind of refining and manifestation of gestures, ideas, and practices that otherwise can sometimes get a bit dry or a bit repetitive. I think there's other things to say, but maybe the only other point that to really mention is that I also believe that psychedelics, properly taken, don't just lead back to the self. The psychedelics open out into the world ineluctably. You are unfolded and spread through history, nature, animals, time. And that experience of being unfolded and mixed and magnified through the outside, through the great outdoors, not just of nature, but of reality itself, I believe can work as a block against the tendency within contemporary secular Buddhism to return to the refined self, the actualized self, the prodded self, the pampered self, the self of well-being industry, the self that is, the entrepreneurial, get-ahead, achievement self of capitalism, which is always in the picture, tugging us like an evil magnet, like the Death Star in Star Wars. And to avoid that, or at least resist it, is one of our challenges, whether we're talking psychedelics or spirituality or yoga or just having a good time. We really have to refine the way in which we can heal, transform, unfold forward, but not revert to the capitalist achievement self, to unfold out into the world with all of its terror, with all of its others, beautiful others, scary others, and with all of the potential frightening and disturbing things on the horizon. And with that, I bid you good night. At least it's good night in my time. So until next week, keep your minds open.